Good to see so many of you here, and welcome to the annual Aquinas lecture. There's probably a number I could put there, but I don't know it. Any historians here know how many we're up to now for Aquinas lectures? Anyway, it is the Aquinas lecture. The aim of the lecture is to educate and inspire the college community, especially current students, with the wisdom of the angelic doctor and the tradition of inquiry rooted in his thought. It is to reinforce, we might say, the ongoing importance and vitality of St. Thomas Aquinas' thought. One could be forgiven for perplexity, however, regarding what exactly might qualify as a tradition of inquiry faithful to the wisdom of the angelic doctor. After all, Alistair MacIntyre has made note of the incommensurability of different historical versions of Thomism, referring to the problem of too many Thomisms. Tracy Rowland has identified 17 different species of Thomism, all the way from strict observance Thomism, if such a thing is even possible or desirable, to postmodern Thomism, again, if such a thing is even possible or desirable. Maybe, to paraphrase Nietzsche, there was only one Thomist, and he died on the way to a council. It is my conviction, however, that our speaker tonight will embody something like both a faithful and a living representation of the thought of the angelic doctor. Dr. David Schindler is professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America in DC. He holds a master's and PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America and a master's in theology from the John Paul II Institute. Dr. Schindler's work engages contemporary cultural challenges and philosophical questions by drawing on the resources of classical Christian tradition. Along with metaphysics and anthropology, he also works in the area of political philosophy, phenomenology, the philosophy of science, the philosophy of religion, and philosophical theology. He combines analytic expertise with a keen attention to history. I've personally benefited from his serious scholarly engagement with the continental tradition. Dr. Schindler has published more than a dozen books, over 70 articles and book chapters, and his work has been translated into 6 languages. He's the editor of the English language edition of Communio, International Catholic Review. He's a board member of the Review of Metaphysics, as well as New Polity, a journal of post-liberal thought. He's the current president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. And tonight he will speak for us on beauty as the wellspring of action in the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Schindler.
Thank you, Professor Sweeney. It's a real pleasure to be here, a real honor to give the Thomas Aquinas lecture. The lecture, it draws on Aquinas, so there are going to be some technical bits, but I made an effort to give the basic argument a kind of obvious simplicity, I hope, that will make it clear, and then I'm going to try to draw some concrete implications from some of the things I talk about. So if you get a little frustrated with some of the more complex things, I don't know how much of a background everybody has in philosophy. Just hold tight. I'll do my best to make it all clear. So in a recent well-regarded book entitled "The Ethics of Beauty," the Orthodox priest, also a grad from CUA, Timothy Petitsas, has argued for a paradigm shift in the way we conceive human behavior and activity, the various expressions of which we can gather under the name ethics. So in contrast to what he calls the truth-first approach, which he believes has dominated the rationalistically inclined West, remember he's an Orthodox theologian, Petitsas proposes that we draw on the more or less untapped resources of the Christian East to recover what he calls a beauty-first approach. Among the many advantages Petitsas expounds in this rich book, it's over 700 pages, are the properly integrative capacities of beauty and the spiritual depths it's able to open up in human life. Where truth-first approach has led us, he says, to conceive of ethics simply as a rigorously rational science of morality, which leaves outside all of those activities that do not immediately concern the question of right and wrong. A beauty-first approach recalls us to the more traditional sense of life as an erotic pursuit of excellence, erotic in the sense of eros, a passionate love. If you've read Plato, you know what I'm talking about. Having its foundation in a falling in love with the beautiful, ultimately with Christ as manifest in the church, and gathering up the whole of existence, both individual and common, in essentially meaningful form. This is what he thinks a beauty-first approach offers. So a beauty-first approach connects ethics, moreover, with the sacramental life, with the mystical depths of liturgy, with prayer, and the historical realities of grace and providence. A recovery of the ever-ancient, ever-new, beauty-first approach, he says, promises to restore the sense of human life from top to bottom as a glorious adventure, a sense that stands in such stark contrast to the oppressive monotony of banalities to which we have largely reduced existence in the contemporary world. And I don't think it is too much to say that the great majority of psychological, sociological, cultural problems that we face can be traced in a certain sense to our having lost the capacity to experience life as an adventure. I think that's worth thinking about. Okay, I noted that Petitsas has described this flushing of eros from life as an ailment that specifically afflicts Western thought. He does not discuss in his book the work of Aquinas, so it's not clear whether he would include Aquinas as a representative of this impoverished truth-first approach to ethics. But it is not uncommon for Orthodox thinkers to lay a good part of the blame on Aquinas' shoulders for what they call Western rationalism. And that opens up a whole discussion that we can't engage in here. In any event, what we can say clearly about Petitsas' work is that he does not explicitly engage Thomas Aquinas as a source for his beauty-first approach. So what I'd like to do in this presentation here this afternoon is to suggest that he could have drawn on Aquinas, though to do so admittedly requires reading Aquinas in a somewhat unfamiliar way. There are a number of reasons I think it's worthwhile to make this suggestion. So not only would it show, I don't need that, that Orthodox and Catholic thought are not opposed to each other, but they share the classical tradition, even if they tend to emphasize different aspects of that tradition. But also, I think it would promise to introduce a conceptual clarity that's sometimes lacking in the more spiritually or mystically inclined East. Most of all, I think, to my mind anyway, is that if this suggestion can be justified, the thesis that I'm going to propose to you here, if it can be justified, I think it would open up a relatively new way of thinking about Aquinas' own interpretation of human action. Okay, so my argument will be relatively simple. First of all, I'm going to recall and elaborate Aquinas' claim that love lies at the foundation of all human activity without exception. This claim can be demonstrated very clearly on the basis of Aquinas' own text. Secondly, I'm going to propose that love ought to be interpreted most fundamentally in relation to beauty as distinct from the good. All right, this is the controversial part of my proposal, and it's a speculative claim. Although Aquinas does gesture towards this interpretation, he much more evidently and regularly presents love in connection with the transcendental property of goodness. So I'm going to offer reasons to think that connecting love specifically with beauty offers a more satisfying account of human action, even on Aquinas' terms. In other words, I'm going to argue that this is the way we ought to interpret Aquinas, even if it cuts against some of Aquinas' explicit statements and clearly against the common view of his thought. Finally, in light of Petit's book, I will reflect briefly on some of the implications of this proposed interpretation, namely that love lies at the foundation of all human action and that beauty lies at the origin of love, showing that Aquinas does indeed offer his own version of a beauty-first approach to ethics, which I think could bear fruit in our contemporary context. So that's what I'm going to do. Clear? Questions yet? All right. And I'm speaking loudly enough, everybody can hear? Okay, good. Okay. Part 1, love as the root of all action. Aquinas treats love in questions 25 and 28 of the Prima Secundae of his Summa. This section discusses love specifically as amor, that is, as the natural human passion, as distinct from caritas, which is the theological virtue. In that case, love specifically as a divine gift of the Father in Christ through the Holy Spirit. That's caritas. I'll be making amor the focus here because we're discussing the nature of human action in general. But I think it would be really interesting to think about what the theological dimension of caritas opens up, and that's something we could discuss in the question and answer period if you'd like. There are 3 things that I want to highlight from this extraordinarily rich section of the Summa. Things that will more or less place on the table what's essential for our argument here. So the first thing I want to highlight from Aquinas' treatment is to note that the discussion of love occurs in Aquinas' treatise on the passions. So he discusses love, amor, as a passion. And indeed, it's in the opening pages of his discussion of the passions. Okay, this is very significant, and it's significant for several reasons. First of all, Aquinas defines love as a passion. What does that mean? A passion is something that we undergo rather than something we first do. Passion comes from the Latin verb patior, to suffer. It's related also to the word passion as suffering, the passion of Christ. And it's connected too with the word passive, something that happens to one as opposed to an action, which is something that one does actively. This is important because one frequently hears it said that for Aquinas, according to Aquinas, love is willing the good of another. You may have heard that description of love. That's not quite right. That's actually not quite right. Aquinas distinguishes love from benevolence. Now, benevolence literally means willing the good of another. And Aquinas says love is not exactly that. It includes benevolence. It includes willing the good of another. But he says that when you talk about love, you're talking about something more than just that. You're including a notion of a bond, he says, of affection. So what does this mean? It means that love is in the first place not an action, but a state of being, a condition, you might say, that we undergo, from which action subsequently proceeds. So we do, of course, will the good of another in love. But love is more than this act of will, as we'll see in a moment. Okay? Another thing to point out about Aquinas' characterizing love as a passion is that passions, according to Aquinas, necessarily involve both body and soul. They involve body and soul as operating together, as distinct from the activities that stem principally from the body, like digestion, or the activities that stem principally from the soul as spirit, which is to say its transcendence of the body, and these are the acts of intellect and will. The love involves both body and soul. The subject of the passions, like that of the sensations, he says, is specifically the body-soul composite, the union of body and soul taken as one. To say that love is a passion is therefore to say that in its human expression, it implicates the whole of human nature at once. I don't think this point receives enough attention in discussions of Aquinas' view of love. I think it ought to be highlighted more, and we'll see why as we continue here. All right, now the second thing that I want to highlight in Aquinas' treatment of love is the definition that he formulates. According to Aquinas, love consists in a single word. The word is complacentia. It's a Latin word. Complacentia. The typical English translation of the word is a bit misleading. When you hear of complacency, you think of something negative. Complacency is something like a smug self-satisfaction. But the Latin word suggests something else. The Latin word complacentia essentially means being pleased with. Placere cum. Complacentia is being pleased with. The prefix here, cum, can either be an intensifier, meaning that you take an intense delight, pleasure in another, or it can indicate a reciprocity. So two beings take delight in each other. That's what complacentia means, two beings taking delight in each other. The reciprocity that I just mentioned is reinforced by another word that Aquinas uses in this context to explain the experience, which is co-optatio, which means a reciprocal adaptation of one thing to another, right? In love, the soul is rendered apt for the other. It's positively disposed towards the other. The other is revealed to it as fitting, as right. So perhaps I didn't know it before, but in this experience of love, now I see it. This other is exactly what I wanted, is perfect for me. That's what co-optatio means. Complacentia co-optatio. I now see that this person or thing is perfect for me. Okay. As Aquinas puts it, in love, quote, the appetible object, so the desired object, gives the appetite, my desire, a certain adaptation to itself, which consists in complacency, complacentia in that object. Thank you. So this is the basic definition of love for Aquinas. Complacentia in the sense of a positive disposition towards some object, whether a person or a thing or an idea or even God. When I love something, it means that I relate to that thing as, in a fundamental way, as good. In a certain sense, specifically good for me. That's what it means to love something. Okay. And you see, that's still distinct from the act of will, where I'm willing the good of it. The love is this prior disposition and experience that leads me to will the good of the other. Okay. The third thing that I want to highlight from this discussion is the profoundly significant fact that Aquinas defines love not just as a passion, but as the first of the passions. So all of the other passions, and the word passion is what we would normally call like emotions or feelings. Passions is a better word for interesting reasons that we could ask about if you're interested in, afterwards. All of the other passions that we experience presuppose the existence of love, this basic disposition. So Aquinas here mentions the four sort of classic passions: joy, sadness, hope, and fear. And if you think about those, all of those presuppose that we're already disposed in love. So what is joy? Joy is what we experience when we receive what we love, when we actually connect with it. We're sad when the thing that we love is taken away. We hope to receive it again, and we fear losing it forever. All of those other experiences presuppose love. Now, Aquinas goes on to explain love is also more basic than negative passions that stem from hatred. And if you think about it, hatred is also a basic disposition, but it's not as fundamental as love. Why is that? Aquinas points out that every hatred actually presupposes a more basic love. But the opposite is not true. So I hate something when it offends against love. So I hate a threat to me. Why? Because I love myself, right? I hate the devil because I love God. I hate Ohio State because I love Notre Dame. But the reverse isn't the case. So you can imagine a condition of perfect love that has no hate, but it would be impossible to imagine perfect hate that has no love, because there has to be something that enables the hate in the first place. Okay. To say that love is the first of the passions, then, means to say that love characterizes our most fundamental relation to reality in general. Everything else, every other relation, is, in a certain sense, a further specification of love, whether it be a positive or a negative specification. Okay? And this leads then to the concluding observation of this first section of my presentation. In the last article of his discussion of love, Aquinas asks whether love, quote, whether love is the cause of all that the lover does. And it seems to me he saves this question for last, because it really serves to sum up everything he wanted to say. Now, the corpus of his response to this question is short and sweet. It's one of these really succinct, just a couple of sentences. And I'll quote it here, the whole thing. He says, every agent acts for an end. Now, the end is the good desired and loved by each one. Wherefore, it is evident, and this is the important part, it is evident that every agent, whatever it be, does every action from love of some kind. Notice this statement couldn't be more absolute and unconditional. Nothing is left out in a certain sense. You might, when you hear the question, whether love is the cause of all that the lover does, you might think that he's just talking about a specific group, lovers as opposed to non-lovers. But as he explains, that's not the case. There's no creature in the world that isn't a lover. And it's interesting, he's not even just talking about human actions. Every movement of anything that happens in the world is an expression of love, analogously. We've been focusing, and we'll continue to focus on human love, but it's, and maybe that's another thing we can talk about. For Aquinas, this is a cosmic thing. Every action of every agent whatsoever. Okay. Hold on to that point. So that's the first point. Everything that happens out of love. Okay, now I'm going to move to the second, and this is the more controversial thing, where I'm going to argue that beauty is at the root of all love. Okay. So it will have been noticed. It will have been noticed that the texts I've cited from Aquinas speak of the good. I haven't mentioned beauty yet. The good rather than the beautiful. As I observed earlier, the standard interpretation of Aquinas classifies love in the order of the good, which is the order that pertains to the will and pertains to the appetite, as he explains our desires, in distinction for Aquinas from the order of the true that pertains to the intellect. Love, Aquinas says in many different places, lies in the order of the good because it concerns the appetible dimension of the human soul, our inclination to fulfill our desires, our inclination towards the good. In fact, for Aquinas and for the whole classical tradition, you actually can define, if there's a single word to define what goodness is in the classical tradition, it's appetibility. That's actually a good definition for the good. Now, this standard interpretation of Aquinas would seem to settle all debate on the question of whether love pertains to good or beauty. It would seem to settle it a priori. And in fact, that impression is confirmed when we read a discussion of the causes of love in the same treatise we've been discussing, and specifically in question 27. Aquinas in this question asks whether, in the very first article, he asks whether the good alone is the cause of love. And when you've all read Aquinas before, I trust. Yes, okay, you know how he works, right? You get the objections, he states his position, then he answers the objections. In his objections, he raises one from Dionysius the Areopagite, who says both the good and the beautiful are the cause of love. And Aquinas wants to argue that only the good is the cause of love, so he has to answer that objection from Dionysius. And in order to answer the question from Dionysius, this is what he says. He explains that, quote, This is a quote from Aquinas. The beautiful is the same as the good, and they differ in aspect only. All right, so it would seem perfectly evident that if beauty is relevant to the understanding of love at all, it's only in an incidental sort of way on the basis of this text. We would say that beauty is a cause of love only to the extent that it's identical with the good. That's what this seems to force us to say. But it would seem to deny that beauty is a cause of love to the extent that it's different from the good. Right? Do you follow me? Okay. I want to propose that that's mistaken. That seems like the obvious interpretation, but I think it's wrong, okay, to put it simply. Why? I'm going to suggest that Aquinas' definition of love that we just considered compels us to place beauty at the center of love. Now, I don't know if this argument that I'm going to make qualifies as a necessary argument in the strictest sense. I'm going to propose it as a fitting argument, but I think that its fittingness, when you start to see how it works, the fittingness is so compelling as to make it inescapable. But I don't know that it's a logically necessary argument, and that's something we can also discuss. Okay, now why am I proposing beauty? Why do I think beauty at the center? It's not only because beauty is the essential principle of love for the whole classical Neoplatonic tradition, beginning with Plato's incomparable meditations on love and beauty in the Symposium and the Phaedrus, and this is the tradition that Petitsus in his book appeals to. It's also because if we read Aquinas' text carefully, it seems to me that they point in this direction too, however much this has been overlooked by commentators. Now, one of the reasons this claim I think is so compelling is that it's so obvious and simple. In response to the Dionysian objection that I've just quoted, Aquinas goes on to say this. He distinguishes beauty from goodness by saying that beauty adds to goodness. So remember, they're identical, except they have a different aspect. And now he's going to specify what the aspect that beauty adds, and it's this. He says that beauty adds to goodness a relation to the cognitive faculty. So that good means that which simply pleases the appetite, while the beautiful is something pleasing to apprehend, to perceive, to see, okay? In other words, to put it in other terms, what Aquinas says, we could say that beauty is goodness specifically as apprehended. Okay, now if that's the case, there's something really surprising. In the very next article, Aquinas asks whether knowledge is the cause of love, and this is the response that he gives. I'm going to read his response, and I'm going to break it down into pieces. The whole response is this. He says, I answer that, as stated above, good is the cause of love as being its object. But good is not the object of appetite, except as apprehended. Therefore, love demands some apprehension of the good that is loved. For this reason, the philosopher, who's the philosopher? Aristotle, says that bodily sight is the beginning of sensitive love. In like manner, the contemplation of spiritual beauty or goodness, and he mentions beauty here, is the beginning of spiritual love. Accordingly, knowledge is the cause of love for the same reason as good is, which can be loved only if known. Okay, so that's his passage. Now look at, we'll take each sentence here. First he says, remember, the good is not the object of love except as apprehended. Okay, compare that to what we just saw and how he distinguishes beauty from love. What does he say there? He says that the difference, they're the same except that beauty is goodness as apprehended. Right? Good is not the object. To say that good is not the object of love except as apprehended is actually just to say, you can translate it, goodness is not the object of love except as beauty. Now, if we do make that substitution in the text, are we reading too much into it? I don't think so. Why? Let's look at the next sentence that he quotes from that I just quoted from the passage. He says, therefore, love demands some apprehension of the good that is loved. So what is the good that is what is the apprehension of the good? Again, it's beauty. Aquinas goes on. For this reason, the philosopher says that bodily sight is the beginning of sensitive love. He's referring to a passage from the Nicomachean Ethics in which Aristotle writes the following, quote, "The pleasure of the eye is the beginning of love. No one falls in love without first being charmed by beauty." The pleasure of the eye is indeed just what Aquinas had described as the essence of beauty, which is taking pleasure in perceiving. He was referring specifically to seeing and hearing. So when Aquinas concludes with the phrase that I mentioned, in like manner, the contemplation of spiritual beauty or goodness is the beginning of spiritual love, he then finishes, accordingly, knowledge is the cause of love for the same reason as good is, which can be loved only if known. Okay, only if, he says, nisi in Latin. There is no love of the good except as apprehended or as contemplated, which is an activity of the cognitive power, right? This is just to say that the good is the cause of love only as beauty. We should note, moreover, that the word beginning that Aquinas uses here is principium, which is, it's the principle or cause, and that's actually the very same language that Aristotle uses. He uses dia as a prepositional phrase in a causal sense. Okay, now, it seems to me that this attention we've given to the first two articles of question 27 already presents a decisive case for the role of beauty in love, but there's even more to say in its favor. Let's return to the definition of love Aquinas had formulated in the previous question. As we saw, he said love is complacencia, or cooptatio, a disposition of the soul toward a thing or a person as good. This disposition is not a part of love, it's the essence of love, the very essence of love, he says. And then Aquinas goes on there to distinguish love both from the desire that follows upon this being disposed and the joy that consists in resting in the good once attained. So here's a quotation from that passage. He says, "The first change wrought in the appetite by the appetible object is called love, and is nothing else than complacency in that object." So very familiar to us already. And then he says, "And from this complacency results a movement towards that same object, and this movement is desire. And last, there is rest, which is joy." Now notice what's going on there. The complacency is not the movement, it's not the rest, it's the principle that enables both. And the principle is what? That whereby the beloved object communicates its form to the soul. It gives its form to the soul. So love, in other words, is the reception of the form of the beloved object into the soul in such a way that it renders the soul apt for the object in its real existence. So notice, this enabling it's what enables the soul then to pursue and desire the object. We might say that love inspires, right? This is what it means by rendering the soul apt. It gives the soul wings to enable it to pursue. It elevates it so that it can actually properly approach its object. It's interesting in the De Malo, Aquinas says that in love, the lover is in certain sense transformed into the beloved. And this is possible only because the lover has received the beloved's form into its soul that's opened it up then to pursue it. Okay, now, as it turns out, in the beginning of the Summa, in question 5, Aquinas defines beauty in relation to the good, again, in just these terms. He says there that the good has the ratio finis, which means that the logic of it is being an end, a terminus, a goal of appetite. This is the intrinsic logic of goodness. We pursue something as fulfilling our appetite. In this respect, we ought to say that goodness corresponds specifically to desire and to joy, as we just characterized them. Both of these, the desire and the joy, we see, involve an end, that to which the soul aspires or that in which it rests. But he says in this passage, Aquinas says in this passage, that beauty does not have the ratio finis. It doesn't have the logic of an end. It has instead the ratio formalis, It's about form, the display of form. One of the Latin words for beauty is actually formositas, formliness. But it's precisely the relation to the good, not specifically as an end, but instead specifically as form, that distinguishes love from desire and joy. What does this mean? It means that love is nothing but the soul's relation to beauty. Now, to say this does not in the least require us to reject Aquinas' claim that love disposes the soul towards the good. Why? Goodness and beauty are transcendental properties. They're not only inseparable from each other, there's a certain sense in which they're identical in re, as he says, in the thing. This argument that I'm making only requires us to see that the disposing of the soul, which is love in its essence, is a function of beauty. Okay? So it's precisely beauty or goodness, just as insofar as it's apprehended, or in other words, insofar as it communicates its form into the appetite of the beholder so as to render him apt for it, it's precisely beauty that disposes the soul to pursue a thing as good. Which is to say that what specifically defines love is not goodness but beauty. Okay, there's one last point that I want to make before concluding this section. This was the technical stuff that I warned you about. But this point is important because it'll bear on our final observations. Aquinas defines the transcendental's goodness and beauty as being, he says, perfective of the human soul. So goodness satisfies our appetite or will, and truth satisfies our mind. So if that's how we characterize goodness and truth, how do we specifically characterize beauty? There doesn't seem to be any faculty that it satisfies. I think that's one of the reasons that Aquinas often leaves it out of the picture. It's worth noting, as I said, that this seems to be perhaps what's motivating Aquinas, and this is also why there's been a debate. If you have studied Thomistic philosophy, anyone who's studied it, there's a big debate about whether Aquinas even recognized beauty as a transcendental property. And I think it has to do with a lot of the things that we're discussing here. Okay, what I'm suggesting is a little speculative, but what I want to propose is that what distinguishes beauty as a transcendental property from goodness and truth is that it is not perfective of a particular faculty. This is an observation that Aquinas makes in his De Veritate when he distinguishes beauty from goodness and truth. To say that beauty is not perfective of a particular faculty, however, does not make beauty imperfect. It seems to me that we ought instead to see that this is highlighting the gratuity of beauty. It's a quality that's, if you've studied philosophy of art, perhaps, you sometimes hear the description of beauty as disinterested. And what it means is when I see something as beautiful, I recognize that it's something that I simply affirm it's good that it exists. I don't care if it's necessarily mine. I don't need to possess it. I'm just happy that it is. There's this gratuitous love of the beautiful. That's something that goodness, I want to possess it, and that's because it satisfies my desire. Beauty, it satisfies me in just beholding it. That's what distinguishes beauty from goodness, and this is what I suggest is the complacency. Okay, when I see something as beautiful, I say that the world is better for the existence of this piece of music or this work of art or this person. I'm happy that you exist. That's the very essence of beauty, and I want to suggest it's the very essence of love. Okay, that brings me to my last section. And I'll take one more second. Excuse me. Timothy Petitsa's proposal of a beauty-first approach to ethics, as we saw, offered a larger view of what ethics really implies than we're used to. Now, as I suggested also, he thinks that this is something that the East can provide. Now, the argument that I've been trying to make here is that there's something similar in Aquinas. This is something also available in the West, from the West, and specifically in Thomas Aquinas. So let's review the argument. The first part of the argument was that every agent, whatever it be, does every action out of love of some kind. And this is because love is the absolute first of the passions. We do not do any action unless we're moved to do that action. But what moves us to do an action is the vision of the beauty of the thing. What moves us is, first of all, the reception of the form into our soul that renders it apt. Without first receiving the form in the experience of beauty, the soul would be unable to act properly towards it. But the reception of form is nothing but the experience of beauty. Therefore, to say that every action whatsoever springs from love is to say that all activity is inspired by beauty. Beauty lies at the very foundation of human existence. Okay, so what does this imply? I think there would be thousands of things one can think about as unfold from this idea that beauty is sort of the foundation of our existence. I think you could spend the rest of your life thinking about it. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend much more time here. I just want to point out some really crucial things, but I think I don't want to make any claim at all to be exhausting the topic here. And maybe you can bring up something in the question period if something occurs to you. Okay, I'm just going to mention three things. First, recognizing not only that every single human action arises out of love of some kind, but also to say that love springs from an encounter with beauty, as we've described it, opens up what we can call an essentially contemplative dimension at the core of human existence, which we might otherwise tend to displace to the margins of our activity. It's not uncommon to think of human life, as I suggested, as a tedious repetition of the same series of activities. We first register information in a relatively detached mode. We pick bits of that information to act on, and then we set about trying to gratify one interest after another. There's a kind of monotony to this, which I think is the shape of a lot of the way people think of life these days. This is a kind of a pragmatic reduction of existence that's become very familiar to us. What's at the root of this? I think sort of a Darwinian reduction of existence to survival of the fittest. And survival means nothing more than just staying alive. But I think it's also, we see versions of this in the rise of artificial intelligence these days. I think it's leading us to rethink of our intelligence simply as processing of information, and it stays at the same sort of level of banality. I want to suggest that the deepest roots of this pragmatic reduction of life is that we've forgotten beauty. We have forgotten the significance of beauty for our existence. And this is something that a great theologian from the 20th century, have you ever heard of Hans von Balthasar? I don't know if you get to read him much, but this is a central point that he makes in theology, that contemporary life can be described as forgetfulness of beauty. Okay, now the reason that I'm saying that a recollection of beauty could restore a contemplative dimension to life is that beauty implies a meaningfulness in which we can dwell, a meaningfulness that includes a robust affirmation, a recognition of value. To relate to the world most basically under the sign of beauty is thus radically different from just a passive registration of information. Beauty is a revelation, which is dramatic and full of mystery. Moreover, as a matter of form, it does not in the first place address itself, as I pointed out, to our appetite in the mode of self-interest. It's instead a revelation of what is good in itself, first of all. All this is to say that under the sign of beauty, the world presents itself most fundamentally as something to marvel at, something that provokes wonder and even awe. And if and when we pursue our interests in this world, we do so within an encompassing spirit of gratitude and reverence. So another way to put this is that the beauty-first approach introduces a sense of gratuity or gift at the foundation of our experience. Still another way to put it is that this conception, that in such a conception, there will be a fundamental disposition towards festivity and playfulness. One of my favorite German authors on beauty, Friedrich Schiller, says that the only way to relate to beauty is in a spirit of play. That we can play only in relation to beauty, and beauty can appear only in the spirit of play. And if that's the case, if it's at the foundation of life, there's going to be a playfulness at the very origin of our activities. Okay. In the presence of beauty, we feel liberated from stress, from the anxiety of accomplishing or failing to accomplish one external purpose or another. We gather ourselves as a whole. Remember, love is whole, body and soul, in a time of celebration and affirmation. Rather than seeing this spirit as an exception to the seriousness of human life that relentlessly persists in demanding our attention, we should recall this beauty at the very center of our lives. We're most fully human when we gather in celebration. And if the direct occasions for celebration are episodic rather than constant, it nevertheless remains the case that something of this spirit belongs at the root of everything that we do. Remember, every agent, whatever it does, da-da-da-da. If beauty is first, this playfulness will suffuse the whole of our existence. Okay, second, because as we've seen, beauty is essentially a matter of form, rooting human action in beauty makes form more centrally relevant to human action than we might otherwise have realized. So what does it mean to make form central in human action? At the outset, I mentioned Petitza's observation that when we think of ethics, now think about if you were to take a class in ethics, what would you expect to do there? You would expect to talk about whether certain actions are good or evil, right? Right or wrong. And those are particular actions. Here's the thing. How often do you in your existence, day-to-day existence, how often do you confront like a genuine moral question? Is this right or is this wrong? Probably not constantly, certainly. Possibly every day, but it's a fairly rare experience that we actually have to make a moral decision like that. And if ethics is only about determining whether action is right or wrong, it's going to have a very small place to play in our life. Most of our existence is going to be left out of consideration as not relevant. But this is very different, I want to suggest, from the ancient view of ethics. When the ancients, when they asked, what is a good life? What does the good life look like? They weren't looking for a list of evil actions to be avoided. What were they looking for? They wanted to ask, what does it mean to be an excellent human being? In a manner that represented the pursuit of an ideal. So it's interesting, the word for good for the ancients was kalon. When they talked about excellence that they pursued, kalon. Does anybody know what that means in Greek? Yeah, beauty. That's the word for beauty. They tended to use the word. When Aristotle talks about pursuing the good life, he actually says the beautiful life. Okay, we've lost this. The ancient world sought to live a beautiful life, a life built on and toward the beautiful. So such a life was not only a matter of moral effort, but sought to make radiantly manifest what was best and truest in human existence. Think about John Paul II's encyclical on ethics. What is it called? Anybody? Veritatis Splendor, which means what? The splendor of the truth. That's beauty. The radiance of it's actually beauty. He understood this. Okay. What becomes most relevant from this perspective is, again, not in the first place the moral value of one discrete act or another. More positively, it's about the order of life, how we organize our existence. And this includes the outward manifestations in culture. So, for example, from a beauty-first approach to ethics, we realize the significance of life of the home, the rhythms that constitute that life. Whether or not they immediately touch on these, is it morally good or morally evil, whether or not that's the issue, the way you live becomes relevant from this beauty-first approach, right? The way we live together, the daily rituals, the traditions of the family meal, of our chores, of praying together, The way we prepare for bed, the celebration of special events, and of the way we follow the seasons, especially the seasons of the church, okay? For another example, from a beauty first approach to work, to the economy, would implicate in extremely concrete ways the organization of the aspects of work, the way we relate not only to other people, but to the natural world, the realities that inspire us and shape our imagination, the common goods that we pursue, even at the cost of more immediate necessities. It's possible to imagine an approach to work that is entirely formless. I mean, it's possible to imagine, because this is, I think, the majority of what people experience these days, an approach that is cynically pragmatic and driven only by the interests, by pure self-interest of the parties. But you can think of work like that nevertheless doesn't do anything morally wrong. And what should we say about that as human beings? What should we say that especially as Christians? Is that an ethical problem, that the work is banal and demeaning, but it doesn't actually commit any evil? It seems to me, from a restricted sense of what ethics is about, that it would be irrelevant. But if you have a beauty first approach that considers, you see, form and this larger sphere of a kind of a meaningfulness, though that's something that would be unacceptable for a Christian. This allows us, I think, to grasp a little bit better the importance of ritual in our lives. And that opens up to liturgy and the sacraments and the things that I mentioned. Those things are important. Liturgy, sacraments, ritual, those are important not only in church, but in life more generally. Now, finally, a beauty-first approach recovers a sense of life as a great adventure. To say that love is the foundation of all action and beauty is the foundation of all love, is to say that the whole of our existence is meant to have the character of falling in love. To be human is to be disposed to fall in love with reality, to be struck by the beauty of the things of this world, and thus, through the wound that it opens in our heart, to be drawn into reality, to want to penetrate to the deepest essences of things and be surprised ever anew, grace upon grace, as St. Paul says. The reason beauty essentially takes us by surprise, why it therefore never ceases to inspire wonder, is that it does not simply present an end, a purpose that fulfills a need that's already there. Instead, it transforms us, as Aquinas says. That's happening right next door. It transforms it. It introduces a new form into our soul, which inspires a new desire and a new capacity to follow it out. So to recall Plato's image, in the experience of beauty, the soul grows wings. The wings lift it beyond the mundane self-preoccupation into which we're regularly attempted to re-enter. So love becomes an adventure in the best sense of the world. And because the beauty that gives the soul wings is not just a rare experience at peak moments in our life, but lies, however hiddenly, at the very core of things, at the origin of everything we do, this adventure can gather up the whole of our existence and give us a profound sense of meaning. So I mentioned in passing at the beginning that a great deal, in my opinion, of the psychological, social, and cultural problems that we face today might be considered consequences of our having lost the capacity to experience life as an adventure. Now, we've seen that this capacity depends in part on our recollecting the central place of beauty in our lives as the wellspring of all our action. And I hope to have shown that to recover this sense, we do not need to abandon the West in order to draw on the treasures of the Eastern Christian tradition, great as those treasures certainly are. We possess a treasure at the center of our tradition, namely the wisdom of Thomas Aquinas, whose feast we celebrate today. The end.